The car engine was still running. I remember staring at the dashboard clock while another contraction tightened around my spine like a slow metal clamp. The hospital entrance was 20 feet away. I could see the sliding doors open and close. Nurses walked past the glass. My husband had just closed the passenger door. He said he would be back in a minute. I watched him cross the parking lot, but he did not walk toward the hospital. He walked toward his parents' car. They were already inside, waiting. His mother never looked at me. His father kept the engine running, and then the car pulled away. I was 8 centimeters dilated, alone, in a locked car, and somehow everyone would later insist that none of this happened the way I remember it. Before that day in the parking lot, my life followed a quiet rhythm. Nothing dramatic, nothing remarkable, just small routines that repeated themselves in predictable ways. I woke up early most mornings, earlier than my husband did. The apartment was usually silent at that hour, the kind of silence that felt steady and familiar. I would make tea, stand by the kitchen window, and watch the street wake up slowly. Delivery trucks, dog walkers, office workers rushing past with coffee cups in their hands. It was the kind of life that looked stable from the outside. My husband preferred to sleep until the last possible minute before work. When he did wake up, the first thing he usually checked was his phone. Messages from his parents were often already waiting. They lived across town, but in many ways they were still very present in our daily lives. At the beginning of our marriage, I thought that closeness was a good thing. His mother called often, sometimes twice a day. She liked to know where we were going, what we were planning, what we had eaten for dinner the night before. She spoke with the calm confidence of someone who had always been listened to. My husband listened to her the same way he always had, carefully, without interruption. It never felt like an argument between us, more like a quiet adjustment. If she suggested a restaurant, that was where we went. If she thought a plan should change, it usually did. My husband never raised his voice when repeating her opinions. He simply explained them as if they were the most reasonable option. Over time, I stopped questioning it, not because I agreed with everything, but because I preferred calm to conflict. I have always been that kind of person. Observing more than speaking, listening longer than most people expect. When I found out I was pregnant, that quiet rhythm of life changed, but only slightly at first. I remember sitting in the bathroom with the test in my hands, watching the small window fill with color. For a long moment, I did not move. Then I walked into the living room and showed it to him. He looked surprised, not unhappy, just surprised. He hugged me after a few seconds, the way someone hugs after processing information rather than emotion. "We will figure everything out," he said. That was his usual answer whenever something uncertain appeared in our lives. "We will figure everything out." When we told his parents, their reaction was much louder than his. His mother's voice rose with excitement the moment she heard the news. She began talking immediately about names, doctors, family traditions. She described the baby as if it already belonged to the entire family. His father nodded quietly beside her, smiling in a satisfied way that made it seem as if something important had been confirmed. I remember sitting on their couch while the conversation moved quickly around me. Plans were discussed. Advice was given. My husband listened carefully, and I mostly listened too. Pregnancy made people speak to me differently. Doctors spoke slowly, explaining details with gentle patience. Friends asked careful questions about how I felt, but inside my own home, things remained calm and structured. My husband attended some of the early appointments, not all of them. Work was often busy, he said. His mother sometimes offered to come with me instead. I usually declined politely. I told myself that everything was normal. Families get involved when a baby is coming. That was what people always said. Still, small patterns began forming that I noticed but did not challenge. Decisions about the pregnancy were rarely discussed between just the two of us. Somehow his parents' opinions were always already part of the conversation. When we talked about the hospital, his mother had strong preferences about which one would be best. When we discussed preparing the baby's room, she had suggestions about furniture, timing, colors. My husband listened to her ideas carefully. Then he repeated them to me later in the evening, as if they had simply occurred to him. I rarely argued. Not because I agreed with everything, but because the atmosphere around those conversations always felt delicate, like something that could fracture if pushed too hard. And I believed something simple back then. I believed that when the day finally came, when labor began and our child was about to enter the world, my husband would be there. Not because anyone told him he had to be, but because some moments in life do not require discussion. They simply require presence. At least that was what I believed. Back then, I still thought trust worked that way, quietly, without needing proof. Pregnancy did not change my life all at once. It changed it slowly, small things first. At the beginning, most conversations about the baby still felt gentle. People asked careful questions. They offered advice in polite ways. My husband continued his usual routines, work during the week, visits with his parents on weekends. Nothing looked unusual from the outside. But certain moments began to stay in my mind longer than they should have. The first one was during a routine doctor's appointment. My husband had planned to come with me that morning. He said he would meet me outside the clinic after finishing a short meeting at work. I arrived early and sat in the waiting room watching the clock. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Eventually, my phone vibrated. It was a message from him. My mother thinks another clinic might be better. She found a doctor she trusts more. Maybe we should look into that. I stared at the message for a while before answering. The appointment had already been scheduled for weeks. My medical records were already there. But when I explained that, his response was calm. We can talk about it later. He did not come to the appointment that day. When I returned home that afternoon, the conversation had already shifted. His mother had researched 3 different hospitals. She had strong opinions about which doctors were most experienced. My husband repeated those opinions carefully, not aggressively, just patiently, as if they were facts that had already been decided somewhere else. I remember sitting at the kitchen table listening. It was not exactly pressure, but it also did not feel like a discussion. A few weeks later, another moment happened. We were supposed to start preparing the baby's room. I had spent several evenings quietly organizing small things, clothes folded into drawers, blankets placed neatly on shelves. That evening, my husband came home later than usual. His parents had visited earlier in the day while I was resting. When he walked into the room, he paused near the doorway and looked around. "My mother thinks it might be better to wait before setting everything up," he said. I asked why. He shrugged slightly. "She thinks it brings unnecessary stress before the birth." I looked around the room again. The crib was already assembled. The small lamp beside it gave off a soft light that made the room feel calm. Nothing about it felt stressful to me. But the next morning, my husband began quietly moving things. Boxes returned to the closet. Blankets folded away again. He did it gently, as if tidying rather than undoing something. I did not stop him, not because I agreed, but because the conversation around it felt strangely firm, like a decision that had already happened somewhere outside the room. Other small things followed. Phone calls that ended when I entered the room. Conversations between my husband and his parents that became quiet when I sat down beside them. Once, during dinner at their house, his mother asked about my next prenatal appointment. I told her the date. She exchanged a brief look with my husband. It was a small look, easy to miss, but it stayed with me. Later that evening, as we drove home, I asked him if something had changed about the appointment. He kept his eyes on the road. "No," he said calmly. "Why would it?" "I thought maybe you had discussed something earlier." He shook his head slightly. "You are probably just tired." That explanation appeared often during those months. You are probably just tired. Pregnancy makes everything feel bigger. You are overthinking small things. Each sentence sounded reasonable when spoken. Calm, gentle, hard to argue with. So most of the time I did not argue. Instead, I began noticing things more carefully. The timing of phone calls. The way conversations shifted when I entered the room. The way my husband sometimes paused before answering simple questions, as if choosing his words with extra care. None of it was clear enough to confront. None of it was dramatic, just small adjustments happening around me, like furniture being moved slightly in the dark. I could still walk through the room, but something about the layout no longer felt familiar. At the time, I told myself that discomfort was normal. Pregnancy changes everything, people said. Your body changes. Your emotions change. Your perspective changes. Maybe that was all it was. Maybe the unease I felt had nothing to do with anyone else. So I stayed quiet, and I kept watching. Because something inside me had begun to realize one quiet fact. Conversations about my own child were starting to happen without me. As the due date moved closer, time began to feel different. People talk about pregnancy as if the final weeks are full of excitement, preparing bags, choosing names, waiting for the phone call that tells family members the baby is on the way. But in my home, the atmosphere felt strangely controlled. Not tense, just careful. The hospital bag sat empty in the closet for a long time. Every time I mentioned preparing it, my husband would say the same thing. "We still have time." At first, I believed him. My doctor had given a general window for the due date, and technically he was right. There were still several weeks left. Still, something about his tone made the conversation end quickly each time. So I began preparing small things quietly on my own. A set of clothes for the baby, my medical documents, a phone charger folded neatly inside the side pocket. I did these things slowly without mentioning them again. One evening, while I was placing folded baby clothes into the bag, my husband came into the room and watched me for a moment. "You do not need to rush," he said. "I am not rushing," I replied. He nodded but did not say anything else. The next day I noticed the bag had been moved slightly deeper into the closet. It was still there, just less visible. I did not mention it. Around that same time, I started noticing something else. Phone calls. My husband had always spoken with his parents regularly, but those calls had become longer recently. Sometimes he stepped into another room while talking. Sometimes he lowered his voice when I entered the space. One afternoon, I walked into the kitchen while he was on the phone. He turned slightly toward the window as I approached. "I will check the dates again," he said into the phone. There was a short pause. Then he added, "Yes, it should still work." When he ended the call, I asked him a simple question. "What dates?" He placed his phone on the counter and looked at me calmly. "My parents were asking about a trip they might take later this year." "A trip?" He nodded. "Just something they have been considering." I remember standing beside the sink, drying my hands slowly with a towel. "When?" He shrugged lightly. "They have not decided yet." That answer should have settled the conversation. But the word dates stayed in my mind longer than it should have. Later that week, another moment happened. We were visiting his parents for dinner. The conversation moved easily between ordinary topics, work, family updates, small neighborhood news. At one point, his father mentioned travel routes, different cities, flight connections. My husband listened carefully while eating. His mother noticed me watching them. "Oh, that is nothing important," she said quickly. Your father-in-law likes planning trips even when we are not going anywhere." Her smile was calm, but my husband did not laugh. On the drive home that night, the car was quiet. I waited a few minutes before speaking. "You mentioned earlier that your parents might take a trip," I said. "Yes. Is it close to the baby's due date?" He kept his eyes on the road. "I do not think so. You are not sure." He paused briefly before answering. "They are still deciding." The conversation ended there. But a few days later, I noticed something that made the unease sharper. My husband had left his laptop open on the dining table while he stepped into the shower. I was not looking for anything. I was just passing by when the screen caught my attention. An email confirmation, airline reservations, 3 tickets. I stood there longer than I expected. The dates were visible near the top of the message. The week looked familiar. I walked to the calendar hanging on the kitchen wall. My due date was circled in blue ink. The airline departure date was 3 days before it. For a long moment, I said nothing. Then I closed the laptop carefully. When my husband came out of the shower later, he looked exactly the same as always, calm, unhurried. I watched him move around the kitchen preparing tea, and I realized something quietly. For weeks, conversations around me had been slightly incomplete, details missing, answers that ended too soon. But now there was something solid, not proof of anything yet, just a red flag that was no longer easy to ignore. Because airline reservations do not appear by accident, and the dates on that screen were very clear, I did not confront him immediately about the airline tickets. For a few days, I simply carried the information quietly. I watched, I listened, and I waited for a moment when the conversation might happen naturally. It came one evening while we were sitting at the kitchen table. Dinner had already ended. The apartment was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. My husband was scrolling through his phone, reading messages with the same calm expression he always had. I poured myself a glass of water and sat down across from him. "I saw something on your laptop earlier this week," I said. He looked up. "What did you see?" "An email confirmation for airline tickets." For a moment, his expression did not change at all. Then he set his phone down. "Oh," he said simply, "your parents are traveling." "Yes." "When?" "Soon." I waited for him to add something else. He did not, so I spoke again. "The departure date is a few days before the baby is due." He leaned back slightly in his chair. "That is only an estimate," he said. "Babies do not always arrive exactly on schedule." His tone was calm, almost instructional. I folded my hands on the table. "Are you going with them?" He hesitated for just a second. "Yes." The word landed softly in the room. I felt something in my chest tighten, but my voice remained steady. "You are planning to travel during the week our child might be born." He shook his head gently. "You are misunderstanding the situation." "How?" "It is a short trip," he said. "Only a few days. And if the baby arrives while you are gone..." He exhaled slowly, as if the conversation was becoming unnecessarily complicated. "That is very unlikely." I watched him for a long moment. Then I asked the question that had been forming quietly in my mind since the moment I saw the email. "When were you going to tell me?" The pause that followed was longer this time. Finally, he answered. "We had not finalized anything yet. You already bought tickets." "Yes, but that does not mean the plan cannot change." The explanation sounded reasonable on the surface, but something about the timing felt strange. "If the plan could change," I asked quietly, "why buy the tickets now?" Before he could answer, his phone vibrated on the table. His mother's name appeared on the screen. He glanced at it briefly. Then he picked up the phone. "I should take this," he said. He stepped into the living room to answer. I could hear his voice through the hallway, speaking in the same calm tone he always used. When he returned several minutes later, his expression had shifted slightly, more careful. My mother thinks you might be feeling overwhelmed, he said. I looked at him. Why would she think that? You have been asking many questions about the trip. I asked one question. He shook his head gently. You asked several. I tried to recall the conversation in my mind. There had only been a few sentences. Still, the certainty in his voice made me hesitate. Pregnancy had changed my memory in small ways before. Sometimes I forgot simple things. Maybe we should all talk together, he continued, so no one misunderstands anything. The next evening, we visited his parents. The conversation happened in their living room. His mother listened carefully while I explained what I had seen on the laptop. I kept my voice calm and spoke slowly. When I finished, she smiled in a sympathetic way. "Oh dear," she said softly, "you must be under a lot of stress." "I am not stressed," I replied. "Pregnancy can make small things feel larger than they are." I looked at my husband. He nodded slightly, agreeing with her. His father remained silent, watching the conversation quietly from his chair. "The trip is only tentative," his mother continued. "Your husband has many responsibilities. Sometimes family matters require short travel. During the week our baby might be born," I asked. She folded her hands in her lap. "You cannot predict these things perfectly." I noticed something then. No one had denied the tickets existed. No one had denied the dates. Instead, the conversation had slowly shifted toward something else. My emotions, my memory, my interpretation of events. By the time we left their house that evening, the original question had almost disappeared. On the drive home, my husband spoke gently. "You should try to relax more," he said. "I am relaxed." "You do not seem relaxed." The words were simple, but they carried a quiet message beneath them. If I continued questioning things, the problem would not be the trip. The problem would be me. And for the first time, I began to understand something clearly. 3 people were calmly telling the same story, a story in which nothing unusual was happening, and I was the only one who seemed to remember the details differently. Still, the airline confirmation email remained real. The dates remained real, no matter how softly the conversation tried to reshape them. After that conversation at his parents' house, something inside me changed. Not loudly, just quietly. I stopped trying to correct the story they were telling. Instead, I started paying attention to what could not be adjusted by conversation. Facts, times, small records that existed outside anyone's explanation. For a few days, nothing unusual happened. My husband behaved normally. He went to work. He spoke politely. He asked if I needed groceries or anything from the pharmacy. If someone had watched our home during that week, they would have seen a quiet couple preparing for a baby. But I had started noticing details differently. One afternoon, while organizing paperwork for the hospital, I realized that I had not seen my husband ask many questions about the birth itself. Not practical ones. Not the kind people usually ask when they expect to be present. What entrance to use during labor? Where to park? How long the admission process takes? Those conversations had mostly been between me and the nurse during my appointments. So during my next visit, I asked a simple question. "Has my husband contacted the hospital about anything?" The nurse looked briefly at her computer screen. "Yes," she said. "When?" "Last week." I waited. "What did he ask?" She scrolled through the notes. "Mostly general questions about patient discharge procedures." That answer stayed with me. "Discharge?" I asked. "Yes, some parents like to plan how quickly they can take the baby home." Her tone was casual, but the detail felt strange. Most people I had spoken with said new parents usually stayed at least a day or 2 in the hospital after birth. My husband had not discussed that with me. When I returned home that afternoon, I mentioned the conversation lightly. "The nurse said you asked about discharge procedures." He was standing near the sink washing a glass. "Yes," he said. Why? He shrugged. I was curious. Curious about leaving the hospital early. It is good to know the options. His answer was calm, not defensive. Still, the question lingered quietly in the room between us. That evening, another small moment happened. My husband was sitting on the couch answering messages on his phone. I was reading in the armchair across the room. At one point, he stood up and walked into the kitchen to refill his water. His phone remained on the couch beside me. The screen lit up with a new message. I was not trying to read it, but the preview appeared clearly before the screen dimmed again. It was from his mother. The message was short. We need to confirm the timing tomorrow. Nothing else, just that sentence. I looked away immediately. When he returned, he picked up the phone and continued typing replies without noticing anything unusual. Later that night, while he was asleep, I lay awake listening to the quiet sounds of the apartment, the refrigerator humming, a car passing slowly outside. My thoughts moved carefully through the details I had collected over the past few weeks. Airline tickets, travel dates, questions about hospital discharge, messages about confirming timing. Individually, each piece could be explained. Together, they began forming a shape that was difficult to ignore. Still, I had not confronted him again, not because I was afraid of the answer, but because I wanted something clearer than suspicion, something that could not be softened by explanations. That moment came unexpectedly 2 days later. I was sorting through mail on the kitchen counter when I noticed a printed document among the envelopes. It was an airline itinerary, 3 passengers, my husband, his mother, his father. The departure time was listed near the top of the page, early morning. The destination was several hours away, and the date was exactly the same one I had seen earlier on the laptop, 3 days before my due date. I stood there for a long moment holding the paper. The kitchen was quiet. Sunlight from the window fell across the counter in a narrow strip. When my husband walked into the room a few minutes later, I was still standing there. He saw the paper in my hand immediately. For the first time in many weeks, his calm expression shifted, only slightly, but enough for me to notice. I placed the itinerary on the table between us. "This arrived in the mail today," I said. He looked down at it, then back at me. "Yes." There was no explanation this time. No suggestion that I had misunderstood something, just a quiet acknowledgement that the plan existed. In that moment, the truth did not fully reveal itself yet, but it stopped hiding. Because airline itineraries, like hospital records, belong to systems, and systems do not adjust themselves to protect anyone's version of a story. They simply record what has already been decided. Labor did not begin the way I expected. For weeks, people had described it as a gradual moment. A slow awareness that something had started. A phone call to the doctor. Careful preparation before heading to the hospital. But when the first contraction came, it arrived suddenly, sharp enough to make me stop walking. I was standing in the kitchen when it happened, one hand resting against the counter while I waited for the sensation to pass. It tightened across my back and abdomen in a slow, deliberate wave. Then it disappeared. For a moment, I stood very still. My husband was in the living room answering emails on his laptop. I walked into the room and told him calmly, "I think labor might be starting." He looked up from the screen. "Are you sure?" "I am not completely sure," I said, but it felt different. He closed the laptop and stood up. The next hour moved quickly but quietly. I called the hospital. The nurse asked several questions and suggested we come in so they could check how far the labor had progressed. My husband packed the hospital bag without speaking much. I noticed he checked his phone twice while we were preparing to leave. Each time, he typed a short reply. The drive to the hospital took about 20 minutes. It was late afternoon, and traffic moved slowly through several intersections. The sky outside the windshield had started turning the soft gray color that appears before evening. At first, we did not speak much. I focused on breathing through the contractions as they came and went. But after a few minutes, his phone vibrated again in the cup holder beside him. He glanced down at the screen. Then he picked it up and read the message. Another contraction began while he was reading. I pressed my hand against the car door and closed my eyes. "Are you okay?" he asked. "Yes," I said quietly. The contraction faded. He placed the phone back in the cup holder, but a few seconds later it vibrated again. This time he picked it up more quickly. I watched him from the corner of my eye while he read the screen. His expression remained calm, but his fingers moved faster while typing the reply. "Your parents?" I asked. "Yes. What did they say?" "Just checking how things are going." I turned my head slightly toward the window. Outside, the hospital building was already visible at the end of the street. "They know I am in labor?" I asked. "I mentioned it earlier." The parking lot was half full when we arrived. My husband pulled into a space near the front entrance. The sliding glass doors of the hospital were only a short distance away. People moved in and out through the entrance. Nurses, visitors, a man pushing a wheelchair. Another contraction began before I could open the car door. This one was stronger. It forced me to lean forward slightly in my seat. My husband waited until it passed before speaking. "I need to step out for a moment," he said. "For what?" "My parents are here." I turned toward him. "They came to the hospital." "Yes. Why?" "They were nearby." The explanation felt incomplete, but another contraction started before I could ask anything else. When it ended, he had already opened his door. "I will be right back," he said. Then he closed the door and walked away from the car. At first, I assumed he was walking toward the entrance to speak with them briefly. But he did not go toward the hospital. He crossed the parking lot in the opposite direction. Toward another car parked near the far row. I recognized the vehicle immediately. His parents' car. The engine was already running. His father sat behind the wheel. His mother was in the passenger seat. My husband walked up to the car and leaned down toward the window. They spoke for a moment. I could not hear the conversation from where I was sitting. Another contraction began while I watched them. Stronger this time. I gripped the edge of the seat and tried to focus on breathing. When the pain eased, I looked up again. My husband had opened the back door of their car. He placed his bag inside. Then he walked around and got into the back seat. For several seconds, nothing happened. The three of them sat inside the car, and then the car began moving, slowly at first. Then it turned toward the exit of the parking lot. I watched it drive away. At first, my mind tried to correct what I was seeing. Maybe they were moving the car. Maybe he was coming back. Maybe there was some explanation that would appear in the next moment. But the car reached the street, turned the corner, and disappeared. I was still sitting in the passenger seat of our car. The engine was running. The hospital entrance was 20 feet away. Another contraction started. This one was so strong I had to hold the door handle to steady myself. When it passed, I tried the door. Locked. I checked the other side. Locked too. My husband had taken the keys. For a moment, the situation felt unreal. Not dramatic, just strangely quiet. People continued walking through the hospital doors nearby. No one noticed the woman sitting alone in a car in the parking lot. I picked up my phone and called my husband. The call rang, then went to voicemail. Another contraction began before I could try again. This one lasted longer. When it ended, I looked toward the hospital entrance again. 20 feet. Close enough to reach if I could get out of the car. But the doors remained locked, and the car that had carried my husband away was already somewhere on the highway. The first person who noticed me was not a nurse. It was a man walking past the parking lot with a small paper bag in his hand. He had probably just come out of the hospital pharmacy. He slowed down when he saw me trying to push the car door open from the inside. Another contraction had already started. The pain forced me to lean forward in the seat again, gripping the handle while I tried to breathe through it. When it ended, I lifted my head and saw him standing beside the window. "Are you all right?" he asked. His voice sounded cautious, the way people speak when they are not sure whether they should get involved. "I am in labor," I said. He looked confused for a second. "In labor?" "Yes." He glanced at the locked door. "Why are you still in the car? My husband has the keys." The explanation seemed to puzzle him. He looked toward the hospital entrance, then back at me. "Wait here," he said. He walked quickly toward the sliding doors. For a few minutes, nothing happened. Then 2 nurses came outside with him. They approached the car carefully, speaking to me through the window while one of them used her phone to call hospital security. Within a few minutes, a security guard arrived with a small tool designed to unlock car doors. The process took less than 30 seconds. The moment the door opened, cool air rushed into the car. A contraction began immediately afterward. One of the nurses placed a steady hand on my shoulder. "We are going to help you inside," she said. They guided me slowly across the short distance to the hospital entrance, 20 feet, the same distance I had been staring at from the car. Inside, the hallway lights felt brighter than usual. Everything moved quickly after that. A wheelchair, a set of questions at the reception desk. Another nurse checking how far the labor had progressed. 8 centimeters, she said quietly. Her voice carried a note of urgency. They moved me to the delivery room within minutes. During the next few hours, the world became smaller. Breathing, contractions, the steady voices of the nurses guiding me through each stage. At some point, someone asked where my husband was. I answered simply, "He stepped out." The nurse nodded without questioning it further. Labor continued. Time blurred in a way that only intense physical moments can cause. Minutes stretched, hours compressed, and then eventually the baby arrived. A small cry filled the room. The nurse placed the baby gently on my chest. For a moment, everything else disappeared. Not the pain, not the exhaustion, just the strange quiet that follows something irreversible. Later that evening, when the room had settled into a softer rhythm, my phone vibrated on the bedside table. A message from my husband. "How are things going?" I stared at the screen. The timestamp showed that the message had been sent several hours earlier, before the baby was born. Another message appeared a few minutes later. I had to leave suddenly with my parents for an urgent situation. Then another. "I tried to call you, but you did not answer." I looked at the phone for a long moment. Then I opened the call history. There were no missed calls from him, only the call I had made from the car in the parking lot, the one that had gone directly to voicemail. The nurse returned a few minutes later to check on the baby. She noticed the phone in my hand. "Has your husband arrived yet?" she asked gently. "No." She nodded and made a small note on the chart attached to the bed. The chart recorded everything: admission time, dilation measurement, delivery time, visitors, witnesses, quiet systems that simply documented what happened. Over the next hour, more messages arrived, each one carefully worded. "I am sorry I could not be there. My parents needed me. We will talk when I get back." I read each message slowly. Then I placed the phone back on the table, because by that point something inside me had become very clear. The moment in the parking lot had not been confusion. It had not been sudden. The airline tickets, the travel confirmations, the messages about timing, the questions about hospital discharge, all of those details had been pointing quietly in the same direction. The trip had always been the plan. Labor had simply arrived earlier than expected. And when those 2 timelines collided, my husband had made a decision. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly. the same quiet way he had handled every other decision during the pregnancy. Except this time, the record of what happened existed outside any explanation. Security cameras in the parking lot, hospital admission logs, witnesses who had opened the car door, facts that did not rely on anyone's memory. For the first time in weeks, I did not feel the need to argue with anyone, because the truth was no longer something that needed to be defended. It had already been recorded. My husband returned 3 days later. By that time, the hospital room had already become familiar to me. The baby slept beside the bed in a small, transparent crib. Nurses moved in and out of the hallway quietly, checking charts, asking gentle questions, adjusting blankets. The first night after the birth had been strangely calm. No visitors, no arguments, just the soft sounds of the hospital at night and the quiet breathing of the child beside me. On the second morning, a nurse asked again if my husband would be arriving soon. "I am not sure," I said. She nodded and made another small note in the file attached to the bed. Every entry in that file included a time. Admission, 5:42 p.m. active labor recorded, 6:03 p.m. delivery, 9:17 p.m. visitors, none. The records did not express opinions. They simply documented events. When my husband finally walked into the room on the third afternoon, he looked composed, not hurried, not ashamed, just calm. He closed the door behind him and looked toward the crib first. "That is the baby," he said quietly. "Yes." He stepped closer and looked down at the child. For a moment he did not speak, then he turned toward me. "I am sorry I could not be here." The sentence sounded practiced. "What happened?" I asked. He sat down in the chair beside the bed. "My parents had a situation that required immediate travel," he said. "We had to leave quickly." I watched him carefully. "You left from the hospital parking lot." "Yes. You said you would be back in a minute." He hesitated briefly. "I intended to come back, but you did not." "No." The conversation moved slowly. Neither of us raised our voices. "My phone battery died," he added. "That is why you could not reach me." I looked at the phone on the bedside table. "You sent messages later." "Yes, when I was able to charge it." I did not argue with the explanation. Instead, I asked a different question. "When did you book the airline tickets?" His expression changed slightly. "We discussed this before." "I want to know the exact day." He thought for a moment. "About 2 weeks ago." "And the departure time?" "Early morning." I nodded. The room was quiet again. After a few seconds, I reached toward the table beside the bed and picked up a small envelope. Inside were copies of several documents the hospital had given me. Admission records, visitor logs, parking security contact information. I placed the envelope on the bed between us. "The security staff asked if I needed a report," I said. His eyes moved toward the envelope. "Why?" "They unlocked the car." The words remained in the air for a moment. "You told them the door was locked?" he asked. "It was locked." He did not answer. "The nurse also documented when I arrived," I continued. I spoke calmly, the same way I had spoken throughout the entire conversation. "There are cameras in the parking lot." Another small silence followed. "My husband's car left the parking lot at approximately 5:38 p.m., I said quietly. "Hospital admission happened 4 minutes later." He leaned back slightly in the chair. "You are making this sound more serious than it was. I am describing what happened." He looked toward the crib again. "Sometimes situations are complicated." I nodded slowly. "Yes," I said. "Sometimes they are." The conversation ended soon after that. He stayed in the room for another 20 minutes, looking at the baby occasionally and checking messages on his phone. Before leaving, he said he would return the next day. When the door closed behind him, the room returned to its quiet rhythm. A nurse entered a few minutes later to check the baby's temperature. She glanced at the chart attached to the bed. Then she wrote another entry. Visitor, husband, arrival time recorded, departure time recorded. No arguments, no raised voices, just another set of details added to the record, because systems do not debate the meaning of events. They simply remember when they occurred. And by then, the timeline of the parking lot was already written in more than one place, not in my memory alone, but in documents that would remain long after any explanation faded. Months have passed since that evening in the parking lot. Life has settled into a new rhythm now. Mornings begin with the quiet sounds of a child waking in the next room. The apartment feels different with those sounds in it, smaller in some ways, more serious in others. People sometimes ask how the birth went. Most of them expect a familiar story. A husband holding his wife's hand, family members waiting in the hallway, photographs taken in the first few hours after the baby arrives. I usually give them a shorter answer. It was quiet, I say. That description is not entirely inaccurate. The hospital was quiet that night. The nurses spoke softly. The hallway lights dimmed after midnight. Even the moment my husband left the parking lot happened without noise. No argument, no explanation. Just the sound of a car engine moving away. My husband still tells the story differently when people ask him. He describes a complicated family situation that required sudden travel. He says he tried to return as quickly as possible. Sometimes people nod politely when they hear that explanation. Sometimes they do not ask further questions, but the details of that evening were recorded carefully. Hospital admission times, security logs from the parking lot, witness statements from the man who called the nurses, systems that documented a moment without needing to interpret it. I do not correct my husband when he speaks. I do not argue with his version of events, because arguments depend on memory. Records do not. And one day, when my child is older, the story of their birth will exist in more than words. It will exist in files and timestamps and quiet documentation, the same way I remember it. A hospital entrance 20 feet away. A locked car. And the moment I realized that some truths do not require anyone else to acknowledge them, they simply remain.